Jack Hollister felt his blood freeze as a ghostly white mare and her dying foal appeared at his cabin door during the worst blizzard in decades. The desperate intelligence in the horse's eyes sliced through years of hardened isolation, demanding a decision that would shatter his carefully constructed solitude forever. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The winter of 1879 had been the cruelest Jack Hollister had ever known. 3 months of bitter cold and relentless snowfall had turned the Montana wilderness into a frozen wasteland that seemed determined to claim everything in its path. Jack had lost 2 good horses and nearly half his cattle to the merciless weather, leaving him with dwindling supplies and a growing sense of desperation. His cabin, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, had become both sanctuary and prison. The rough-hewn logs and simple furnishings offered shelter from the howling winds and driving snow, but they couldn't ward off the crushing loneliness that had settled over him like a shroud. It had been weeks since he'd spoken to another human being, the nearest town a treacherous 2-day ride that was now impossible to attempt. On this particular morning, Jack awoke to an eerie silence. The wind that had been screaming for days had finally subsided, leaving behind a stillness that seemed almost unnatural. He rose from his narrow bed, joints aching from the cold that had seeped into the cabin despite his best efforts to keep the fire stoked through the night. The embers in the hearth glowed dimly, offering little warmth against the freezing air. He added wood to the fire, watching as the flames gradually grew, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Coffee was a luxury he'd been rationing carefully, but today he decided to indulge. The bitter brew would provide both warmth and the illusion of companionship as he faced another day of solitude. Jack moved to the small window, using the sleeve of his worn flannel shirt to clear a patch in the frost that coated the glass. The world outside was transformed, buried beneath a blanket of pristine white that sparkled in the morning sun. The snow had stopped, at least for now, and the sky had cleared to a brilliant blue that seemed to mock the desolation below. It was as he stood there, coffee cup in hand, that he spotted the first hint of movement at the edge of the clearing. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, conjuring phantoms from the emptiness. But then he saw it clearly. A flash of white against white moving slowly but deliberately toward his cabin. He set down his cup and reached for his rifle, years of frontier living having taught him to approach the unknown with caution. Peering through the window again, he could now make out the distinct shape of a horse, its white coat nearly invisible against the snow. It was moving with difficulty, each step a struggle through the deep drifts. As the animal drew closer, Jack could see it was a mare, her sides heaving with exertion and her head hanging low with exhaustion. But it wasn't until she turned slightly that his heart clenched with understanding. A foal moved alongside her, so small and fragile that it seemed impossible it could survive in such conditions. The mare stopped about 20 yards from the cabin, as if unsure whether to approach further. The foal pressed against its mother's side, seeking warmth and protection. Both animals were clearly at the end of their strength, their bodies thin beneath their winter coats, steam rising from their nostrils in the frigid air. Jack recognized them now. They belonged to the wild herd that roamed the valley to the east, a group he'd observed many times during his hunting expeditions. The white mare was distinctive, her coat unmarked by the dapples and spots that characterized many of her companions. He'd noticed her pregnancy last fall, but hadn't expected the foal to arrive until spring. Nature, it seemed, had other plans. He watched as the mare took another labored step forward, then stopped again, her eyes fixed on the cabin. There was something in that gaze that struck him, not just the animal fear he'd seen in countless wild creatures, but something that seemed almost like deliberate intent. It was as if she had come here seeking something specific. The rational part of his mind told him to stay inside. Wild horses were unpredictable, potentially dangerous, and certainly not his responsibility. He had enough trouble keeping himself alive through this brutal winter without taking on additional burdens. But another part of him, a part buried beneath years of hardship and solitude, responded to the silent plea in those dark eyes. Before he could reconsider, Jack was pulling on his heavy coat and boots, preparing to step outside. The cold hit him like a physical blow as he opened the door, the air so frigid it burned his lungs with each breath. The mare startled slightly at his appearance but didn't flee, another indication of her desperate condition. The foal trembled visibly, its spindly legs barely supporting its weight. "Easy now," Jack murmured, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." He stood perfectly still, allowing the animals to become accustomed to his presence. The mare regarded him warily. Nostrils flared as she caught his scent on the breeze. The foal peered at him with wide, curious eyes, too young to have learned fear of humans. After several minutes, Jack slowly retreated into the cabin, keeping his movements measured and calm. From the doorway, he watched as the mare took a hesitant step forward, then another drawn by the warmth emanating from the open door. The foal followed, staying close to its mother's side. It was madness, Jack knew, to invite wild animals into his home. They could destroy his meager possessions, injure him if frightened, or simply make it impossible for him to maintain the clean, ordered existence that had helped preserve his sanity through the long months of isolation. But as he looked at the mare's exhausted form and the foal's trembling legs, he found he couldn't turn them away. Something about their presence on his doorstep felt deliberate, almost fated, as if they had been sent to him for a purpose he couldn't yet understand. "Come on then," he said softly, stepping aside to make room in the doorway. "It's too cold for any of God's creatures to be out there today." The mare hesitated at the threshold, her instincts warring with her need for shelter. The foal pressed forward eagerly, but she blocked its path with her body, still uncertain. Jack remained perfectly still, barely breathing as he waited for her decision. Finally, with a soft snort that clouded the air, she stepped forward into the cabin. The foal followed immediately, its tiny hooves clattering on the wooden floor. Jack closed the door behind them, shutting out the bitter cold and sealing the three of them together in the small, fire-lit space. He had no idea what would come of this strange encounter, what consequences might follow from this impulsive act of compassion. All he knew was that for the first time in months, he was no longer alone. For better or worse, his solitude had been broken by these unexpected visitors, and nothing would be quite the same again. The mare stood trembling in the center of the cabin, her dark eyes darting nervously around the unfamiliar space. The foal pressed against her flank, its white coat gleaming in the firelight. Jack remained by the door, giving the animals space to acclimate to their new surroundings. He'd handled plenty of horses in his 36 years, but never a wild mare with a newborn foal, and certainly never inside the confined space of his one-room cabin. "You're safe now," he said softly, though he knew the words meant nothing to the animals. It was the tone that mattered, the gentle rumble of a human voice offering reassurance rather than threat. The cabin suddenly felt much smaller with its new occupants. Jack's home was modest, a rough-hewn table and chair near the hearth, a narrow bed against the far wall, shelves holding his limited provisions, and hooks where his few spare clothes hung alongside his tack. Every surface was meticulously ordered, each item in its proper place, a habit born from years of solitary living, where routine provided structure in an otherwise chaotic world. The mare's tail swished, knocking a tin cup from the table to the floor with a clatter that made both horses start. The foal stumbled, its spindly legs struggling to maintain balance on the unfamiliar wooden boards. Jack moved slowly to retrieve the cup, his movements careful and deliberate. "We'll need to establish some ground rules," he murmured, setting the cup back on the table. "But first, You both need water and something to eat." He moved to the corner, where he kept a large barrel of clean snow he'd melted for his own use. Using a wooden bucket, he scooped some water and placed it on the floor near the horses. The mare approached cautiously, her nostrils flaring as she sniffed the offering. After a moment's hesitation, she dipped her muzzle into the bucket and drank deeply, water dripping from her whiskers. The foal watched its mother, then attempted to mimic her actions, nearly dunking its entire head in the process. Jack couldn't help but smile, the first genuine smile to cross his weathered face in months. "Careful there, little one," he said. "There's plenty to go around." As the horses drank, Jack assessed their condition more thoroughly. The mare was dangerously thin, her ribs visible beneath her winter coat. The foal, despite its fragile appearance, seemed in better shape, suggesting the mother had sacrificed her own well-being to provide for her offspring. Both animals bore small cuts and scrapes, evidence of their difficult journey through the frozen wilderness. Jack had precious little to spare, but he knew the horses needed nourishment. He moved to the back of the cabin, where he kept a small store of hay for his own mount, currently sheltered in the lean-to behind the cabin. The familiar smell caused the mare's head to lift immediately, her ears pricking forward with interest. He placed a modest portion on the floor, knowing he needed to be careful with how much he gave them. Wild horses unaccustomed to regular feeding could founder if allowed to eat too much too quickly. The mare approached the hay and began to eat with restrained eagerness, while the foal sniffed at the offering before tentatively taking a few strands into its mouth. "That's right," Jack encouraged. "Take it slow, we've got time." Time was something Jack had in abundance, too much of it in truth. The days stretched endlessly before him, one bleeding into the next with little to distinguish them beyond the basic tasks required for survival. He'd come to these mountains 5 years ago, seeking solitude after the war, after Antietam and the horrors he'd witnessed there. What he'd found instead was a kind of emptiness that threatened to consume him entirely. As he watched the horses eat, Jack became aware of the changes they had already brought to his carefully ordered existence. The floor was marred with wet hoof prints and scattered bits of hay. The air, previously scented only with wood smoke and coffee, now carried the earthy smell of horse, not unpleasant but unfamiliar in this context. The silence he had grown accustomed to was broken by the soft sounds of chewing and the occasional snort or shuffle of hooves. These disruptions, which would have irritated him just hours ago, now felt strangely welcome. There was something comforting about the presence of other living creatures, even if they weren't human. They brought warmth and movement to a space that had grown as cold and static as the frozen world outside. The foal, having eaten its fill, began to explore the cabin with the boundless curiosity of the very young. It approached Jack's bed, stretching its neck to sniff at the wool blanket. The mare watched vigilantly, ready to intervene if her offspring encountered danger. "That's my sleeping place," Jack told the foal. "You'll have to find your own." He realized he would need to make arrangements for where the horses would rest. The cabin floor was hard and cold, unsuitable for animals accustomed to bedding down on soft earth. Moving carefully around the mare, Jack gathered his spare blankets and arranged them in the corner farthest from his bed but still within the warming radius of the hearth. "It's not much," he acknowledged, "but it'll be warmer than snow." The mare regarded his efforts with apparent understanding, though she made no move toward the makeshift bedding. Jack recognized that trust would come slowly, if at all. Wild creatures didn't easily abandon the instincts that had kept them alive, and a few hours of shelter didn't erase a lifetime of wariness toward humans. As the day progressed, an uneasy truce developed between the cabin's occupants. The mare remained standing, shifting her weight occasionally to rest one hind leg and then the other, but never fully relaxing her vigilance. The foal, with the resilience of youth, grew bolder in its explorations, though it never strayed far from its mother's side. Jack busied himself with his daily chores, stoking the fire, mending a torn shirt, checking his dwindling supplies. These tasks, normally performed in solitude, took on new significance with an audience. He found himself explaining his actions aloud, narrating each step as if the horses could understand him. "Beans again for supper," he told them as he prepared his evening meal. "Not much variety this time of year, I'm afraid." The sound of his own voice, so rarely used these past months, felt strange in his ears. His words emerged rusty and halting at first, but gradually smoothed as he continued his one-sided conversation. It occurred to him that he might be going mad, talking to animals as if they were people, but he dismissed the concern. If madness brought comfort in this isolated wilderness, perhaps it wasn't something to be feared. Night fell early, as it always did in winter, darkness pressing against the windows like a living thing seeking entry. Jack lit the oil lamp on the table, its gentle glow creating a small circle of warmth against the encroaching shadows. Outside, the wind had begun to rise again, moaning through the pine branches and finding the small gaps in the cabin's construction. As he prepared for sleep, Jack cast a final glance at his unusual guests. The mare had finally settled onto the blankets he'd arranged, her legs folded beneath her. The foal lay curled against her side, its breathing deep and even in the peaceful slumber of the innocent. For the first time, the mare's vigilance seemed to have eased slightly, her eyes half closed as she rested. "Good night," Jack whispered as he extinguished the lamp. "Sleep well." In the darkness, with only the red glow of the banked fire providing illumination, he could just make out the white shapes of the horses against the shadows. Their presence filled a void he hadn't fully acknowledged until now, bringing a strange sense of purpose to his isolated existence. Jack awoke to the unfamiliar sound of movement in his cabin. For a disorienting moment, he reached for the pistol he kept beside his bed, his mind racing with half-forgotten battlefield instincts. Then reality reasserted itself as his eyes fell upon the white mare and her foal. The events of the previous day came flooding back, and his hand moved away from the weapon. Dawn light filtered weakly through the frost-covered windows, casting the cabin in a pale blue glow. The mare was already awake, standing alert near the door as if contemplating her next move. The foal remained curled on the blankets, its small sides rising and falling with each breath. "Morning," Jack said softly, his voice rough with sleep. "I reckon you're wondering if you've made a mistake coming in here with a human." The mare's ears flicked toward him, acknowledging his voice without showing fear. Progress, Jack thought. A small victory in the fragile relationship forming between them. He rose slowly, pulling on his boots and adding wood to the fire before it could die completely. The temperature had dropped overnight, and his breath clouded in the air despite being indoors. Outside, through the small window, he could see fresh snow had fallen, adding another layer to the already deep drifts surrounding the cabin. "Looks like you made the right choice after all," he told the mare as he peered outside. "You wouldn't have lasted another night out there, especially with the little one." The foal stirred at the sound of activity, struggling to its feet with the charming awkwardness of the very young. Its legs splayed momentarily before finding purchase on the wooden floor. Once upright, it immediately sought its mother, butting its head against her flank in a request for breakfast. Jack turned away to give them privacy as the mare allowed her foal to nurse. Instead, he busied himself with his morning routine, melting snow for water, preparing a simple breakfast of coffee and cornmeal mush, and taking stock of his supplies. The mental inventory was concerning. If the winter continued much longer, he would need to hunt despite the dangerous conditions or risk starvation before spring. Now he had 2 more mouths to feed, albeit temporarily. The hay would last another week at most if he was careful. After that, Jack pushed the thought aside. He'd faced worse challenges and survived. This would be no different. As he ate his breakfast, Jack found himself studying his guests more carefully. The mare's coat, though dulled by hardship, was a remarkable pure white that seemed almost luminous in the dim cabin. No markings interrupted the snow-like color, not even the faintest dapple or spot. The foal matched its mother perfectly, a miniature version right down to the intelligent dark eyes that watched Jack's every move. "You're not like the others from that herd," Jack mused aloud. "They're mostly paints and sorrels. Where did you come from, I wonder?" Stories circulated among the settlers and native tribes about ghost horses that roam the mountains, visible only in snowstorms or by moonlight. Jack had dismissed such tales as superstition, the kind of myths that inevitably arose in places where nature's power dwarfed human presence. Yet sitting across from these otherworldly creatures, he could understand how such beliefs took root. After eating, Jack needed to check on his own horse and the few remaining cattle in the lean-to shelter behind the cabin. The mare grew visibly anxious as he donned his heavy coat and reached for the door. "I'll be back," he assured her, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. "Just need to see to my own animals." The cold outside hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and instantly numbing any exposed skin. Jack moved quickly through the deep snow to the shelter where his gelding and 3 cows huddled together for warmth. The animals greeted him with subdued enthusiasm, more concerned with the hay he brought than with his company. As he distributed feed and broke the ice in their water trough, Jack's thoughts returned to the mare and foal. His gelding, a sturdy buckskin named Sergeant, had been his sole companion for years. How would he react to the newcomers if they stayed beyond this storm? Upon returning to the cabin, Jack found the foal had worked up the courage to explore more thoroughly in his absence. It stood by his bed, nosing curiously at the worn quilt. The mare remained near the door, but her posture had relaxed somewhat, suggesting she was gradually accepting the safety of their shelter. "Finding anything interesting?" Jack asked the foal, stamping snow from his boots. The foal startled at his entrance but didn't flee, another small sign of growing trust. Instead, it watched him with those intelligent eyes, seeming to assess him as thoroughly as he had assessed it earlier. The day passed in a strange new rhythm, Jack working around the horses as they settled into the shared space. He mended a torn shirt, whittled a piece of pine into the rough shape of a horse, and read a few pages from his dog-eared copy of the Iliad, one of the few books he'd carried with him from his previous life. The mare seemed fascinated by his reading. Her ears pricked forward whenever he spoke the ancient words aloud. Jack found himself performing for her, giving voice to the epic battles and divine interventions with more animation than he had felt in years. "You like Homer, do you?" he asked when he finally set the book aside. Didn't expect to find a classical scholar in a wild horse. The comment triggered memories of his life before the war, before the mountains, classrooms at Harvard where he'd studied literature and philosophy, dreaming of becoming a professor until the conflict pulled him and so many others into its bloody maw. Those ambitions seemed to belong to another person now, a ghost as insubstantial as morning mist. Midday brought a brief respite in the weather, the clouds parting to allow weak sunlight to stream through the windows. The mare grew restless, moving repeatedly to the door and back again. Jack understood her dilemma, the instinct to return to freedom warring with the need for shelter and food. "It's your choice," he told her, opening the door to reveal the snowy world outside. "I won't keep you prisoner." Cold air rushed into the cabin, causing the fire to dance and flare. The mare approached the doorway, her nostrils flaring as she tested the air. The foal followed, pressing eagerly forward until it stood at the threshold, tiny hooves just touching the snow beyond. For a long moment, the mare stood poised between two worlds, the wild freedom that was her birthright and the unfamiliar safety of human shelter. Jack held his breath, surprised by how much he hoped she would choose to stay, at least until the worst of winter had passed. The foal made the decision for them both. It stepped fully into the snow, its delicate legs immediately sinking into the deep drift. A sound of distress escaped it as it struggled to move forward, its inexperience with such conditions becoming immediately apparent. The mare nickered softly, nudging her offspring back toward the cabin with gentle persistence. Jack stepped aside as both horses retreated from the doorway, the mare's decision clear. They would remain, for now. He closed the door against the cold, relief washing through him with unexpected intensity. "Smart choice," he told them, returning to the fire to warm his chilled hands. "Maybe in a few days when the little one's stronger." The mare met his eyes across the small space, and Jack could have sworn he saw understanding there, a silent acknowledgement of their temporary alliance against the brutal winter outside. 3 days passed in this strange domestic arrangement, each one bringing subtle shifts in the relationship between Jack and his equine guests. The mare, whom he had begun calling Ghost in his mind for her ethereal appearance, now accepted hay directly from his hands. The foal, dubbed Spirit for its lively curiosity, had grown bold enough to nuzzle Jack's palm when he sat reading by the fire. The weather outside had worsened again, with winds howling around the cabin like vengeful spirits and temperatures dropping so low that the walls creaked with cold. Jack silently thanked whatever providence had brought the horses to his door when it did. They would not have survived such conditions in the wild, especially the vulnerable foal. "You know," Jack said to Ghost as he prepared a thin stew from his dwindling stores, "I never thought I'd be grateful for company out here. Came to these mountains to be alone, to forget." He stirred the pot hanging over the fire, the simple act of speaking aloud to another living creature bringing unexpected comfort. But there's a difference between solitude and loneliness. Took me too long to figure that out. Ghost watched him with those intelligent dark eyes, her ears forward as if genuinely listening to his words. Spirit was investigating a pair of Jack's spare boots in the corner, occasionally looking up at the sound of his voice before returning to its exploration. That afternoon, as weak daylight filtered through the clouded window, Jack found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, telling his story. Perhaps it was the isolation, or the strange intimacy that had developed between him and these silent, attentive creatures, but the words began to flow from him like water from a broken dam. "I was a professor once, or nearly so," he told them, whittling another small wooden figure as he spoke. "Teaching assistant at Harvard, studying the classics, had my whole future mapped out. Tenure, scholarly papers, maybe even a book or two." He laughed, the sound hollow in the quiet cabin. Then the war came. The mare shifted, settling herself more comfortably on the blankets that had become her designated space. The foal had curled up against her side, dozing in the warmth from the fire. Enlisted right away. Patriotic fervor, I suppose, or maybe just the foolishness of youth. Thought it would be over quickly. His hands stilled on the carving, memories pulling him back to places he'd tried to forget. It wasn't. He described Antietam in halting words, the cornfield-turned slaughterhouse, the sunken road filled with bodies, the bridge where men fell like autumn leaves in a storm. As he spoke, the burden he'd carried for 15 years seemed to lighten slightly, shared now with these creatures who offered no judgment, no platitudes, only silent acceptance. "Took a Minier ball in the shoulder and nearly lost the arm," he continued, unconsciously rubbing the old wound that ached in cold weather. But that wasn't the worst injury, the worst was here. He tapped his temple. Couldn't sleep without seeing their faces, friends, enemies, it didn't matter. They were all just boys, most of them. Ghost nickered softly, a sound that might have been encouragement or simple coincidence. Jack chose to believe the former. Tried to go back to academia after I healed, but the classrooms felt stifling, the debates trivial. How could I argue about Homer's meter when I'd seen what men are capable of doing to each other? He set aside the half-finished carving, a small horse that bore a striking resemblance to Spirit. So I came west. Thought I could outrun the memories if I just went far enough. Night fell early, as it always did in winter, and Jack lit the oil lamp before checking his supplies again. The mental tally was becoming a source of increasing concern. If the winter stretched on much longer, they would all face the specter of starvation. Already he had reduced his own portions to ensure the horses received adequate nourishment, his belt notched tighter to accommodate his shrinking waistline. "We've got a problem," he told his companions as he closed the nearly empty flour bin. "Another week, maybe 2 if we're careful, and then—" He didn't finish the sentence. There was no need. The mare watched him with that uncanny perception that still unsettled him at times. Jack wondered if she understood more than he gave her credit for, if some level of communication existed between them that transcended the barrier of species. That night, as he lay in his bed listening to the wind's mournful keening, Jack found himself contemplating options he would never have considered before the horses arrived. The nearest settlement, a small trading post and way station, lay 2 days' ride to the south. In good weather, the journey was merely arduous. In these conditions, it would be perilous at best, suicidal at worst. Yet staying meant certain starvation once the supplies ran out. At least the journey offered a chance, however slim. "What do you think, Ghost?" he whispered into the darkness. "Risk everything on a desperate gamble or wait here for a slow death?" No answer came beyond the soft sounds of horse breathing and the persistent howl of the wind. Jack closed his eyes, decision postponed but not abandoned. Morning brought unexpected clarity in the form of silence. The wind had stopped completely, and when Jack peered through the frost-edged window, he saw a sky of such perfect blue it seemed almost artificial. The storm had broken, at least temporarily. "If we're going to make a run for the trading post, this is our chance," he told the horses as he pulled on his heaviest coat and checked his rifle. "I can be back in 4 days with supplies, 5 at the most." The thought of leaving Ghost and Spirit alone in the cabin for that long troubled him deeply. They had hay and water, and the shelter would protect them from the elements, but so many things could go wrong in his absence. Yet the alternative, taking them with him, seemed even more dangerous, especially for the foal. Jack knelt beside Spirit, running a gentle hand down the foal's slender neck. "You be good for your mama," he murmured. "I'll be back before you know it." To Ghost, he felt compelled to offer a more substantial explanation. "I have to go," he told her, meeting those intelligent eyes directly. "We'll all starve otherwise. I'll bring back food for all of us, I promise." The mare regarded him steadily, her expression unreadable. Then, to Jack's astonishment, she stepped forward and pressed her muzzle gently against his chest, a gesture so unexpected and tender that he felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I'll take that as permission," he said when he could speak again. Preparations for the journey were simple by necessity. Jack had little to take beyond his rifle, some ammunition, a small portion of his remaining food, and a flint for making fires. Sargent, his buckskin gelding, seemed almost eager for the expedition when Jack entered the lean-to shelter, perhaps sensing a break in the monotony of winter confinement. As Jack saddled Sargent, checking the cinch with meticulous care, he found himself speaking aloud again, voicing the fear he'd been holding at bay. "What if they're not here when I get back? What if they leave?" The thought of returning to an empty cabin, of never knowing what became of the white mare and her foal, filled him with a desolation that surprised him with its intensity. In just a few days, these creatures had carved out a place in his heart that he'd thought permanently closed after the war. Jack took one final look at Ghost and Spirit before closing the cabin door. The mare stood watching him, her eyes reflecting the firelight, while the foal dozed peacefully on the blankets. He had left them with enough hay to last a week and filled containers with fresh water. The fire was banked to burn slowly, providing warmth without the risk of sparks. He'd done everything possible to ensure their safety in his absence, yet anxiety gnawed at him as he mounted Sargent and turned toward the southern trail. The cold was brutal, seeping through his layers of clothing and settling into his bones despite the exertion of travel. The snow lay deep across the landscape, transforming familiar landmarks into alien shapes that required careful navigation. Sargent moved steadily beneath him, the gelding's experience in mountain winters proving invaluable as he picked his way through treacherous terrain. By midday, they had covered less ground than Jack had hoped, the effort of breaking trail through deep snow slowing their progress considerably. The sky remained clear, a small mercy for which Jack was profoundly grateful. If another storm caught them in the open, their chances of survival would be slim. "Keep moving, old friend," Jack encouraged Sargent as the horse labored up a particularly steep incline. "We've got a long way to go yet." The gelding's ears flicked back at the sound of his voice, acknowledging the encouragement if not the meaning. Their breath clouded around them, crystallizing in the frigid air like ephemeral sculptures that disappeared with each step forward. Jack's thoughts returned repeatedly to the cabin and its unusual occupants. He tried to focus on the journey, on the careful calculation of distance and time that could mean the difference between life and death in such conditions. Yet his mind drifted continually to Ghost's intelligent eyes, to Spirit's playful explorations, to the unexpected warmth their presence had brought to his solitary existence. They made camp as darkness fell, finding shelter in a small copse of pines where the snow was less deep beneath the evergreen canopy. Jack built a small fire, its flames a poor imitation of the hearth he'd left behind. As he chewed on a piece of jerky, his meager ration for the evening, he spoke to Sargent as if the horse could carry his words back to the cabin somehow. "They'll be all right," he said, trying to convince himself as much as his equine companion. "Ghost knows how to care for her little one. They're safe, warm, fed, better off than we are right now, that's certain." Sargent simply continued methodically chewing the handful of grain Jack had allowed him, pragmatic in his acceptance of current circumstances. The night passed slowly, Jack dozing fitfully beside the fire, waking often to add fuel and check the surroundings. Wolves sometimes grew bold during harsh winters, driven by hunger to approach humans more closely than they otherwise might. The rifle remained within easy reach, a precaution born of long experience in the wilderness. Dawn brought renewed determination. Jack broke camp quickly, eager to cover as much ground as possible while daylight and clear weather held. The temperature had dropped further overnight, and he found himself having to dismount occasionally to walk alongside Sargent, the movement necessary to maintain circulation in his extremities. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Ghost had already established a new routine in Jack's absence. She inspected the door periodically, standing before it as if expecting him to return at any moment. When he didn't appear, she would return to Spirit, nudging the foal gently before settling back onto the blankets Jack had arranged for them. Spirit, less concerned with the human's absence, took advantage of the expanded territory to explore previously forbidden corners of the cabin. The foal's curiosity led it to Jack's trunk, where it managed to nose open the lid, revealing the few mementos Jack had preserved from his former life. A tarnished pocket watch, several books, a small daguerreotype of a woman whose features suggested a family resemblance, and a folded uniform jacket with a bullet hole visible near the shoulder. Ghost supervised these explorations with maternal vigilance, intervening only when Spirit attempted to chew on the leather binding of the Iliad. She gently pulled the foal away, guiding it back toward the hay Jack had left for them. The instinct for self-preservation ran deep, overriding curiosity when it came to potential food sources. The cabin grew gradually cooler as the banked fire burned down. Ghost seemed to understand the connection between the diminishing flames and the falling temperature. She watched the hearth with evident concern, moving closer to it as the warmth receded. Spirit pressed against her side, seeking the additional warmth of her body. By the second day of Jack's absence, the fire had died completely. The temperature inside the cabin, while still better than the brutal cold outside, had dropped significantly. Ghost and Spirit huddled together on the blankets, their body heat the only source of warmth now available to them. Ghost's attention returned repeatedly to the woodpile beside the hearth. She had watched Jack add logs to the fire multiple times, observing the immediate result as flames leapt higher and heat increased. Now she approached the pile cautiously, nosing at the split logs with apparent deliberation. After several minutes of investigation, she managed to grasp one of the smaller pieces between her teeth. With careful movements, she carried it to the hearth and dropped it onto the cold ashes. Nothing happened. She repeated the process with a second piece of wood, then a third, arranging them roughly as she had seen Jack do. The logical connection between wood and fire had been established through observation, but the crucial element, the spark to ignite the fuel, remained beyond her understanding or capability. Still, there was something remarkable in the attempt, in the leap of comprehension that connected objects to outcomes through observed patterns. Jack, unaware of these developments, continued his arduous journey toward the trading post. The second day of travel proved even more challenging than the first. The trail descended into a narrow valley where the snow had drifted deeply, in some places reaching Sargent's chest. Progress slowed to a painful crawl as they fought their way through these sections, each step requiring tremendous effort from both man and horse. By evening, Jack was forced to acknowledge that they had covered less than half the distance to the trading post. At this rate, the journey would take 4 days rather than 2, depleting his limited supplies far more quickly than planned. The return trip would be equally difficult, potentially stretching his original estimate of 4 to 5 days into more than a week. "What do you think, Sergeant?" he asked as they made camp for the second night. "Press on or turn back?" The gelding offered no opinion, focused entirely on the small portion of grain Jack measured out for him. The decision would have to be Jack's alone: continue toward uncertain help or return to the cabin where supplies were dwindling, but Ghost and Spirit waited. He thought of the mare's gentle nudge before his departure, that moment of connection that had felt almost like understanding. He had made a promise to return with supplies, not just for himself, but for them as well. The thought of breaking that promise, of returning empty-handed to face their silent trust, was almost as unbearable as the thought of not returning at all. "We'll give it one more day," he decided finally. "If we haven't reached the trading post by tomorrow evening, we turn back. That's the best compromise I can offer." Sargent nickered softly, perhaps responding to the sound of his voice, perhaps agreeing with his decision. Either way, Jack took comfort in the noise, a reminder that even on this frigid mountainside, he was not entirely alone. Dawn of the third day broke with an ominous gray light that made Jack's heart sink. The clear blue sky that had blessed his journey thus far had disappeared overnight, replaced by heavy clouds pregnant with snow. He broke camp quickly, urging Sargent to a faster pace while the trail remained visible. If snow began falling before they reached the trading post, they might lose their way entirely. "Just a few more hours," he told the gelding as they crested a ridge that offered a momentary view of the valley below. "If we're lucky, we'll make it before the storm hits." Luck, however, had never been Jack's faithful companion. By mid-morning, the first flakes began to fall, large, lazy crystals that seemed harmless enough at first. Within an hour, the gentle snowfall had transformed into a swirling curtain that obscured landmarks and coated Jack's eyelashes with ice. The temperature plummeted as the wind rose, cutting through his layers of clothing like a knife. Jack hunched lower in the saddle, relying on Sargent's instincts to keep them on the trail. The gelding moved with cautious determination, head lowered against the driving snow. They had been partners too long for Jack to doubt the horse's ability, yet fear crept up his spine with cold fingers as visibility decreased to mere yards ahead. His thoughts turned again to Ghost and Spirit alone in the cabin. Had he been foolish to leave them? The question tormented him as he pushed forward, each step a battle against the elements. If he died out here, they would slowly starve, trapped inside with dwindling hay and no means of escape. The image of their bodies, thin and still on the cabin floor, drove him with renewed determination. "Keep going," he urged Sergeant, his voice nearly lost in the howl of the wind. "We can't stop now." At the cabin, Ghost had developed a new strategy for maintaining warmth. Unable to revive the fire, she had dragged Jack's bedding, blankets, quilt, and even his straw-filled mattress into a pile near where the hearth's residual warmth lingered longest. She and Spirit nestled in this makeshift nest, their body heat retained by the layers of fabric. The foal seemed content with this arrangement, sleeping peacefully against its mother's side. Ghost, however, remained alert, her ears constantly swiveling toward the door at every sound. The wind's moaning sometimes mimicked human approach, causing her to rise expectantly before settling back with what appeared to be disappointment when Jack failed to appear. On the morning of the third day, as snow began falling outside, Spirit discovered a new diversion. The foal had been investigating the cabin's corners when it knocked over a small wooden box Jack had left on a shelf. The box split open upon impact, spilling its contents across the floor. Half a dozen small carved wooden animals crafted during long winter evenings when Jack's hands needed occupation, while his mind wandered through memories. Spirit approached these curiosities with typical foal inquisitiveness, nosing at a wooden bear, then a wolf, and finally a horse that bore a striking resemblance to Sergeant. Ghost watched this exploration with maternal vigilance, intervening only when Spirit attempted to chew on one of the carvings. The storm outside intensified, snow accumulating against the cabin windows until only a diffuse glow indicated the presence of daylight. Wind found every tiny gap in the cabin's construction, creating miniature whistling drafts that stirred dust from corners and chilled the air further. Ghost and Spirit retreated deeper into their nest of bedding, preserving warmth as the temperature continued to drop. Meanwhile, Jack had reached a critical juncture in his journey. The storm had obliterated all familiar landmarks, leaving him disoriented in a world turned white. Logic told him to continue downhill, following the natural path that would eventually lead to the valley where the trading post stood. Yet each step felt like a gamble, a blind guess in a landscape rendered featureless by snow. By mid-afternoon, Sergeant was struggling badly, the snow now reaching his chest in places. The gelding's breath came in labored puffs, his sides heaving with exertion. Jack dismounted to lighten his burden, now leading the horse through the deepest drifts, breaking trail with his own body. The cold had penetrated so deeply that Jack no longer felt his extremities. His fingers, despite thick gloves, had lost all sensation, making it difficult to maintain his grip on Sergeant's reins. His feet might as well have been blocks of wood for all the feeling that remained in them. These were dangerous signs, precursors to the fatal hypothermia that claimed so many winter travelers. "Just a little further," he told Sergeant, though he had no idea if this was true. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, slurred and distant as if coming from someone else. "We can't stop here." Stopping meant death. Jack knew this with absolute certainty. If he surrendered to the overwhelming urge to rest, to close his eyes for just a moment, he would never open them again. The snow would cover him gently, transforming man and horse into anonymous lumps that would remain hidden until spring thaw revealed their grim remnants. It was Ghost's face that kept him moving, those intelligent eyes that had seemed to understand his promise to return, and Spirit, so young and vulnerable, depending on him in ways the foal couldn't possibly comprehend. They had become, in just a few short days, the closest thing to family Jack had known since before the war. The thought struck him with unexpected force, nearly bringing him to his knees in the snow. Family. He had fled human connection for so long, burying himself in the wilderness to escape the memories of those he'd lost. Yet somehow these wild creatures had bypassed his carefully constructed defenses, creating bonds he had believed himself incapable of forming again. "We're going to make it," he told Sargent with renewed determination. "We have to." As darkness began to fall, Jack's situation grew increasingly desperate. The temperature continued to drop, and the storm showed no signs of abating. His pace had slowed to a painful crawl, each step requiring monumental effort from legs that threatened to buckle beneath him. Sargent followed doggedly, the loyal gelding seemingly understanding the life-or-death nature of their struggle. Then, just as Jack was beginning to accept that he had made a fatal error in judgment, a faint glow appeared in the distance. Not the natural phosphorescence of snow and darkness, but the steady artificial light of human habitation. The trading post lay just ahead, its windows beacons of hope in the swirling white chaos. "Look there," Jack gasped to Sargent, pointing with a hand he could no longer feel. "We've made it, old friend." The gelding lifted his head, perhaps sensing the change in his master's demeanor, perhaps catching the scent of other horses or humans carried on the wind. With renewed energy, they pushed forward toward salvation, leaving a wavering trail of footprints that disappeared almost as quickly as they were made, erased by the relentless storm. The trading post was little more than a rough-hewn log structure with a stable attached, but to Jack, half frozen and exhausted, it appeared as magnificent as any palace. Light spilled from its windows, golden squares against the darkening storm, promising warmth and shelter. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, dissipating quickly in the howling wind. Jack stumbled the final yards, Sargent plodding faithfully beside him. His hands, numb and useless, could barely manage to pound on the heavy wooden door. He sagged against the frame, strength finally deserting him now that safety was within reach. The door swung open, releasing a blessed wave of warmth along with the mingled scents of wood smoke, coffee, and humanity. A broad-shouldered man with a gray-streaked beard stood framed in the doorway, lantern held high to illuminate the unexpected visitors. "Good Lord!" the man exclaimed, taking in Jack's frost-covered form and the exhausted horse behind him. "Get in here before you freeze solid, man." Jack managed 2 steps inside before his legs gave way entirely. Strong hands caught him before he hit the floor, half carrying him toward the blazing hearth that dominated one wall of the trading post's main room. From a distance, Jack heard voices calling for blankets, hot coffee, someone to see to his horse. The world narrowed to the overwhelming sensation of heat against his frozen skin, painfully intense as circulation began to return to his extremities. "You're a damn fool to be traveling in this," a voice said above him. Jack focused with effort on the face of his rescuer, the bearded man who had opened the door. "Nathan Price," the man introduced himself. "I run this outpost." Jack Hollister, Jack managed through chattering teeth, had no choice, supplies running low. A mug of something hot was pressed into his hands, which someone had freed from his frozen gloves. Jack couldn't feel his fingers enough to grip it properly, so Nathan held it to his lips, allowing him to sip the scalding liquid. Coffee liberally laced with whiskey. It burned all the way down, igniting a fire in his belly that began to spread outward. "Where'd you come from?" Nathan asked as he wrapped another blanket around Jack's shoulders. "Cabin, North Ridge. 3 days' ride in good weather." Jack's thoughts were fragmented, struggling to form coherent sentences as his body fought to restore normal temperature. "North Ridge, you're the hermit then. Folks in these parts wondered if you'd survive this winter." Jack would have laughed if he'd had the strength. Hermit, that's how they saw him. Once the label might have pleased him, confirmation that he'd successfully severed ties with the world that had brought him so much pain. Now it felt hollow, an inadequate description of a man who had opened his home and heart to wild creatures that needed him. "Not alone anymore," he mumbled, causing Nathan to lean closer. "You've got company up there? Someone else crazy enough to winter in these mountains?" Jack's mind filled with images of Ghost's intelligent eyes, Spirit's playful exploration of the cabin. "Horse," he said. "White mare and foal. In my cabin." Nathan exchanged glances with another man who stood nearby. "Fever's making him delirious," the second man suggested quietly. "No," Jack insisted, finding strength from somewhere deep within. "They came during the storm. Let them in. Need supplies. For them too. Hay, grain." His rescuers clearly didn't believe him, but Nathan nodded indulgently. "Sure, friend. We'll get you what you need once you've warmed up and rested." Jack wanted to argue, to make them understand the urgency of his situation, but exhaustion claimed him before he could form the words. He slipped into unconsciousness, his last thoughts of Ghost and Spirit waiting for his return. Back at the cabin, the storm had transformed the world outside into a howling maelstrom of white. Snow had piled against the door and windows, effectively sealing the horses inside. The temperature continued to drop as night deepened, the cabin's interior now cold enough that Ghost's and Spirit's breath formed visible clouds with each exhalation. Ghost had gathered every scrap of fabric in the cabin into their nest, blankets, Jack's spare clothing, even the rough curtains from the windows. She and Spirit huddled in this makeshift den, preserving body heat as best they could. The hay Jack had left was running low, forcing Ghost to ration their consumption carefully, allowing Spirit to eat while she made do with less. The foal seemed to sense the seriousness of their situation, remaining unusually quiet and still against its mother's side. Occasionally, Spirit would rise to drink from the water containers, which had developed a thin crust of ice on their surface, before returning to the warmth of their shared nest. Ghost's attention remained fixed on the door, her ears constantly alert for any sound that might indicate Jack's return. Her wild instincts, honed through generations of survival on the frontier, recognized the deadly nature of their circumstances. Without food, without adequate warmth, their chances of surviving until spring were vanishingly small. Yet something kept her from attempting to break out of the cabin. Perhaps the memory of the brutal cold outside, perhaps some deeper understanding that their best hope lay in the human's return. Whatever the reason, she maintained her vigilant watch, conserving energy while caring for her offspring with unwavering dedication. At the trading post, Jack awoke to find sunlight streaming through a small window. He had been moved to a narrow cot in a back room, piled with blankets and positioned near a small stove that radiated welcome heat. His clothes had been removed, replaced with dry garments that smelled of wood smoke and unfamiliar herbs. For a moment, disorientation clouded his mind. Then memory rushed back with crushing force. The journey, the storm, Ghost and Spirit waiting at the cabin. How long had he been unconscious? He struggled to sit up, his body protesting every movement with aches that suggested severe exposure to cold. Nathan appeared in the doorway, carrying a steaming bowl that filled the small room with the aroma of meat and vegetables. "You're awake," he observed. "Good. Beginning to wonder if you'd sleep through to spring." "How long?" Jack croaked, his throat painfully dry. "Just overnight. Storm's cleared, believe it or not. Blew itself out sometime before dawn." Nathan handed him the bowl and a spoon. "Eat. You need your strength." Jack accepted the stew gratefully, each spoonful restoring vitality to his depleted body. Between bites, he asked, "My horse?" "Your gelding's fine. Got him in the stable, feeding him up. Tough animal to make it through that journey." "I need supplies," Jack said, setting aside the half-finished stew. "Need to head back as soon as possible." Nathan's bushy eyebrows rose in surprise. "You can't be serious. You nearly died getting here. Another day in that condition and we'd be digging a grave come spring thaw." "I made a promise," Jack insisted, throwing back the blankets. The room spun alarmingly when he tried to stand, forcing him to grip the edge of the cot for support. "They're waiting for me." "This white mare and foal you mentioned?" Nathan's tone made it clear he still believed this was the product of a fever dream or prolonged isolation. "Maybe you should rest another day, clear your head." Jack met the older man's skeptical gaze with fierce determination. "They're real. They came to my door half dead from cold and hunger. I took them in, promised to return with supplies." He straightened, forcing his weakened legs to support his weight. "I don't break promises, Nathan." Something in Jack's voice must have convinced Nathan, for the older man's expression shifted from skepticism to cautious belief. He studied Jack's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. Let's say I believe you've got wild horses holed up in your cabin. That doesn't change the fact that you're in no condition to make the return journey yet." Nathan gestured to Jack's still trembling legs. "You can barely stand, let alone ride through mountain country in winter." "I don't have a choice," Jack insisted, though he knew Nathan's assessment was accurate. His body felt as though he'd been trampled by a herd of buffalo, every muscle screaming with the aftermath of extreme cold and exertion. "They'll starve if I don't get back soon." Nathan sighed, scratching his beard thoughtfully. "Tell you what, rest today at least. Give your body a chance to recover somewhat. I'll help you gather supplies, and if you're stronger by morning, I won't try to stop you leaving." It was a reasonable compromise, though every hour of delay increased Jack's anxiety about Ghost and Spirit's welfare. Finally, he nodded agreement. "One day, no more." "Good. Now finish that stew before it gets cold. Best medicine for what ails you." Jack obeyed, his stomach growling as he consumed the remaining food. When he'd finished, Nathan helped him to a chair near the trading post's main hearth, where several other men were gathered. They regarded Jack with open curiosity. Visitors were rare in winter, and his dramatic arrival during the storm had clearly made him an object of interest. "This here's Jack Hollister," Nathan introduced him. "Rode in from the North Ridge last night, nearly frozen solid." A wiry man with a drooping mustache extended his hand. "Eugene Whitaker, trapper. What brings you down from your mountain in this weather, friend?" Jack hesitated before answering, recalling Nathan's skepticism about Ghost and Spirit, but he'd never been one for fabrication, even when the truth sounded implausible. "Wild horses. A mare and foal sought shelter at my cabin during the storm. Took them in, but my supplies were running low." He expected disbelief, perhaps even mockery, but Eugene's weathered face lit with interest. "White mare? No markings?" Jack stared at him in surprise. "Yes. How did you know?" Eugene exchanged glances with the other men around the fire. "Folks have been seeing her for years. Some call her the ghost mare. She appears during storms, then vanishes when the weather clears. Some say she's a spirit guide. Others claim she's the reincarnation of a Mustang stallion that died saving his herd from wolves." "She's flesh and blood," Jack insisted, "and she has a foal now, pure white like its mother." A third man, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "Indians believe white animals are sacred, messengers from the spirit world. Medicine man at the reservation told me once that if a white animal seeks you out, it's bringing powerful magic." Jack had never put much stock in such superstitions, yet he couldn't deny there had been something extraordinary about Ghost from the first moment he saw her at his door. Something in those intelligent eyes that seemed to transcend ordinary animal awareness. "Magic or not, they need food, and I intend to bring it to them," he said firmly. Throughout the day, as Jack rested and regained his strength, the trading post's inhabitants brought him supplies for his return journey: sacks of grain, bales of hay, preserved foods that would sustain him through the remainder of winter. No one questioned his story again. Indeed, they seemed almost reverent about his connection to the legendary white mare. By evening, Jack's condition had improved considerably. The deep chill had left his bones, and though he was still sore, he could move without pain. Nathan had packed the supplies efficiently, distributing weight evenly across Sargent and a second horse he'd offered to loan for the journey. "You sure about this?" Nathan asked as they finished the preparations. "Another day of rest wouldn't hurt." "I'm sure," Jack replied. "Need to start at first light tomorrow. With luck, I can make it back in 2 days." That night, as he lay on the cot listening to the quiet creaking of the trading post settling in the cold, Jack's thoughts returned constantly to Ghost and Spirit. Were they still waiting? Had they somehow broken out of the cabin, returning to the wild despite the deadly conditions? The possibility filled him with an emptiness he hadn't experienced since the war, since watching friends fall around him on blood-soaked fields. At the cabin, conditions had deteriorated further. The hay was nearly gone, and one of the water containers had frozen solid. Ghost had managed to break the ice on the remaining container, allowing Spirit to drink, but dehydration was becoming as serious a threat as starvation. The temperature had dropped so low that frost now coated the inside walls of the cabin. Ghost and Spirit remained in their nest of fabric, conserving warmth and energy. The Foal had grown listless, its playful exploration of the cabin replaced by long periods of sleep interrupted only by increasingly infrequent nursing. Ghost divided the last of the hay, pushing the larger portion towards Spirit while taking only a few stalks for herself. Her wild instincts, honed through countless generations of survival, recognized the dire nature of their situation. Without food, without adequate warmth, their time was limited. Yet still she waited, her attention fixed on the door through which Jack had departed days earlier. Something beyond instinct, beyond ordinary equine cognition, told her that their best hope lay in his return, that the human who had opened his shelter to them would not abandon them to the winter's mercy. Dawn broke clear and cold on the 5th day of Jack's absence. At the trading post, he rose before anyone else, dressing quickly in the clothes Nathan had provided: heavy wool pants, a thick flannel shirt, and a buffalo coat that would provide better protection against the cold than his old jacket. Sargent and the borrowed horse, a sturdy roan gelding Nathan called Rusty, were waiting in the stable, already saddled and loaded with supplies. Jack checked the bindings one final time, ensuring nothing would shift or fall during the journey. He couldn't afford delays or lost provisions. Too much depended on his swift return. Nathan appeared as Jack prepared to mount, offering a final parcel wrapped in oilcloth. "Coffee and some jerky for the trail," he explained. "And this." He handed Jack a small leather pouch. "Medicine Man gave it to me years back. Said it offers protection to travelers. Figure you could use all the help you can get." Jack accepted the gifts with gratitude, tucking the pouch inside his coat. He was not a superstitious man, but the previous days had shaken his certainty about many things. If there was even a chance that Ghost was more than an ordinary mare, that her appearance at his cabin had some deeper meaning, then perhaps there was room in his worldview for a little indigenous magic as well. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Nathan clapped him on the shoulder. "Get those horses fed and come back to tell us the rest of the story when spring arrives. I've got a feeling it's just beginning." The journey back to the cabin proved even more arduous than Jack had anticipated. Though the storm had passed, it had left behind drifts deep enough to swallow a horse in places. He led Sargent and Rusty carefully, seeking paths where the snow was shallowest, but progress remained painfully slow. The weight of the supplies, life-saving though they were, further hindered their advance through the treacherous terrain. Jack's body, still recovering from his near-death experience, protested every step. His muscles ached, his lungs burned in the frigid air, and the old wound in his shoulder throbbed with renewed intensity. Yet he pushed forward relentlessly, driven by an urgency that transcended physical discomfort. Not much farther, he encouraged the horses as they struggled up a steep incline, though in truth they had covered less than half the distance to the cabin. "We'll rest at the top." The medicine pouch Nathan had given him bounced gently against his chest with each step. Jack had never been one to believe in charms or talismans, yet he found himself drawing comfort from its presence. The knowledge that Ghost was somehow significant beyond his personal connection to her, that she was recognized, even revered by others, had altered his perception of their relationship. Perhaps there was indeed something magical about the white mare's appearance at his door, something beyond mere chance or animal instinct. By nightfall of the first day, Jack had covered less ground than he'd hoped. Exhaustion forced him to make camp in a sheltered hollow where towering pines offered some protection from the wind. As he unsaddled the horses and provided them with small portions of the precious grain, he found himself talking to them as if they could convey his words to Ghost and Spirit. "Tell them I'm coming," he said, running a hand down Sergeant's frost-coated neck. "Tell them to hold on just a little longer." Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of the cabin, of returning to find it empty, or worse, of finding Ghost and Spirit still and cold on the floor, his promise broken, his return too late. Each time he woke with a racing heart, reassuring himself that such visions were merely the product of anxiety, not premonition. At the cabin, Ghost had made a critical decision. With the hay completely gone and both water containers now frozen solid, remaining inside meant certain death. Though weak from hunger and affected by the bitter cold, she still possessed the strength to attempt escape, if not for herself, then for her foal. The mare approached the cabin door, studying it with the same intelligence that had led her to attempt building a fire days earlier. She had watched Jack operate the latch mechanism multiple times, observed the simple movements that opened and closed this barrier between shelter and freedom. Stretching her neck, Ghost used her teeth to grasp the crude wooden handle, pulling it downward as she had seen Jack do. The latch didn't budge at first, her grip insufficient to apply the necessary force. She tried again, positioning her teeth more securely, putting the full weight of her head behind the effort. This time the latch gave way with a metallic click that seemed unnaturally loud in the cabin's silence. Ghost pushed her muzzle against the door, which swung open with a groan of protesting hinges. Immediately, a blast of Arctic air swept into the cabin, carrying swirling snow and the scent of the wilderness beyond. Spirit nickered questioningly from their nest of blankets, reluctant to leave the relative warmth of the cabin despite the dire circumstances. Ghost returned to her foal, nudging it gently but insistently to its feet. The young horse wobbled unsteadily, weakened by hunger and the cold that had seeped into its bones despite Ghost's protection. With patient determination, Ghost guided Spirit toward the open door. The foal balked at the threshold, instinctively recoiling from the biting cold outside. Ghost paused, seeming to weigh their options, certain slow death inside versus the slim chance of survival in the frozen wilderness. After a moment's hesitation, she made her choice, stepping back from the door and using her body to herd Spirit away from the opening. They would wait longer. Something beyond normal equine understanding. Perhaps the same instinct that had led her to Jack's cabin in the first place told her that leaving now would be a mistake. Their best hope still lay with the human who had shown them kindness. Ghost used her teeth to grasp the edge of the door, pulling it closed against the wind's resistance. The latch didn't catch, leaving the door slightly ajar, but it was enough to prevent most of the snow from entering and the worst of the heat from escaping. She returned to their nest, allowing Spirit to press against her side, sharing what little warmth remained in her body. Dawn of the second day broke with startling clarity, the sky a crystalline blue that belied the deadly cold blanketing the landscape. Jack broke camp with stiff, painful movements, his body protesting the renewal of yesterday's exertions. The rub of Nathan's medicine pouch against his chest reminded him of the trading post owner's parting words. "I've got a feeling it's just beginning." What was beginning? Jack wondered as he saddled the horses and secured the supplies. A new chapter in his solitary existence? A relationship with creatures that somehow bridged the gap between wild and tame? Or something more profound? A healing of the wounds he'd carried since Antietam. Wounds that went far deeper than the physical scar on his shoulder. These questions occupied his mind as he resumed the journey, leading the horses along a ridge that offered slightly easier passage through the snowbound wilderness. The sun climbed slowly in the sky, offering light but little warmth, the temperature remaining well below freezing despite its brightness. By midday, Jack recognized landmarks that indicated they were drawing closer to the cabin. The distinctive outcropping of rock that locals called Eagle's Perch appeared on his left, meaning his home lay just a few miles ahead. Hope surged through him, providing renewed energy despite his exhaustion. Then disaster struck. As they descended a steep slope, Rusty lost his footing on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. The gelding went down heavily, supplies scattering as the ropes securing them snapped under the sudden strain. Jack barely managed to jump clear, avoiding being crushed beneath the falling horse. "Whoa, easy boy," he called, rushing to Rusty's side as the horse struggled to regain his feet. The gelding's panicked movement sent more supplies sliding down the hillside, including one of the precious bales of hay. Jack watched in dismay as it tumbled into a ravine, irretrievable without hours of dangerous effort he couldn't afford to spend. When Rusty finally stood, Jack's experienced eyes immediately spotted the problem. The horse was favoring his right foreleg, putting no weight on it when standing still. A closer examination confirmed his fears, a sprain or possibly a fracture, making it impossible for the gelding to continue carrying the heavy load of supplies. "Damn it all," Jack muttered, calculating rapidly. He would have to redistribute the remaining supplies onto Sargent, leaving behind anything non-essential. The delay was maddening when he was so close to home, when every hour might mean the difference between life and death for Ghost and Spirit. Working quickly despite his exhaustion, Jack redistributed the remaining supplies onto Sargent's back. The gelding stood patiently, seeming to understand the urgency of their situation. Jack was forced to leave behind one of the grain sacks and some of his own provisions, but he kept all the remaining hay. Ghost and Spirit's survival depended on it most immediately. "You'll have to make it back on your own," Jack told Rusty, removing the gelding's saddle to relieve any additional pressure on the injured leg. "I can't wait, and you can't come with us. Head downhill. You'll find the trading post eventually." It felt wrong to abandon the horse, but Jack had little choice. Rusty was Nathan's animal, not his, and the gelding had a far better chance of survival returning to the trading post than attempting to follow Jack through deep snow with an injured leg. Jack gave the horse a final pat, then turned away, leading Sargent toward home with renewed determination. The final miles seemed endless, each step through the deep snow requiring monumental effort. Jack's body operated on pure will now, driven beyond exhaustion by the fear of what might await him at the cabin. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, shadows lengthening across the pristine white landscape. He had perhaps 2 hours of daylight remaining, enough to reach the cabin if he pushed hard but barely. "Almost there," he told Sargent as they crested the final ridge, the cabin now visible in the small clearing below. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney, confirming Jack's fear that the fire had gone out days ago. The structure looked abandoned, lifeless against the snow-covered backdrop. No movement, no sign that Ghost and Spirit remained inside. Jack's heart clenched with dread as he approached the cabin door. He noticed immediately that it wasn't properly closed. It stood slightly ajar, allowing snow to drift inside. Had the horses somehow escaped? Or had something more sinister occurred during his absence? Drawing a deep breath, he pushed the door fully open, bracing himself for what he might find. The cabin's interior was dim, most of the windows obscured by snow. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, Jack scanned the space with increasing desperation. Then he saw them, two white forms huddled together in a nest of blankets and clothing in the corner nearest the cold hearth. Neither moved at his entrance, and for a terrible moment, Jack feared he had returned to find only corpses, his promise broken by cruel circumstance. "Ghost," he called softly, his voice breaking. "Spirit." At the sound of his voice, the mare's head lifted weakly. Her eyes, dulled by hunger and cold but still alert, found his across the cabin. She made a soft, nickering sound that seemed to contain both greeting and relief. Beside her, Spirit stirred as well, the foal's movements feeble but undeniably alive. "Thank God," Jack whispered, dropping to his knees beside them. "I made it back." He moved with urgent efficiency, first rekindling the fire with wood that remained stacked beside the hearth. As flames began to lick upward, he returned to Sergeant, unloading the precious hay and grain. The gelding followed him inside without hesitation, seeming to understand that the cabin had become shelter for all of them now. Ghost watched these preparations with evident interest, her head remaining raised despite the obvious effort it cost her. When Jack approached with an armful of hay, she allowed him to place it directly before her, though she waited until he stepped back before eating. She nudged a portion toward Spirit, ensuring her foal fed before taking more for herself. Jack melted snow for water, placing a container within easy reach of the horses before attending to his own needs. The cabin gradually warmed as the fire grew stronger, dispelling the deadly chill that had pervaded the space during his absence. He removed his heavy outer garments, finally allowing himself to acknowledge the bone-deep weariness that threatened to overwhelm him now that the immediate crisis had passed. As darkness fell outside, Jack settled on the floor beside Ghost and Spirit, unwilling to leave them even to sleep in his own bed. Ghost's intelligent eyes followed his movements, watching as he leaned back against the wall, stretching his legs toward the fire's warmth. "I'm sorry it took so long," he told her, reaching out tentatively to stroke her neck. To his surprise, she allowed the touch, even leaning slightly into his hand. "But I kept my promise. I came back." Something shifted in that moment, a barrier breaking down between human and wild creature, between solitude and connection. Jack felt tears welling unexpectedly, the emotion he'd suppressed for so many years finally finding release. He wept quietly, his hand resting on Ghost's neck, the contact grounding him as memories of all he'd lost flowed through him. Comrades from the war, family left behind, years spent in isolation, nursing wounds both physical and spiritual. Ghost remained still beneath his touch, offering silent companionship as he confronted his grief. Spirit, growing stronger with each passing hour as warmth and nourishment revived the foal, eventually rose on wobbly legs and approached Jack directly. With the innocent trust of the very young, the foal settled beside him, laying its head across his lap as naturally as if they'd been companions since its birth. Jack laughed through his tears, stroking the foal's silky mane. "Well, look at you. Getting friendly now that I've proven useful, is that it?" Nathan's words echoed in his mind. "I've got a feeling it's just beginning." Perhaps the trading post owner had been right after all. Perhaps this strange encounter with Ghost and her foal wasn't simply about survival through a harsh winter, but the start of something new, a healing of old wounds, a return to the world of connection and relationship he'd abandoned after the war. The medicine pouch still hung against his chest, a tangible reminder of the belief that white animals brought powerful magic. Jack wasn't sure he believed in such things, not literally, but he couldn't deny that ghost and spirit had already worked a kind of magic in his life, breaking through the walls he'd built around himself, reminding him that solitude and isolation weren't the answer to past pain. As the night deepened around the cabin, snow began falling again outside, gentle flakes that whispered against the windows rather than the howling storm that had first brought Ghost to his door. Jack found himself telling stories aloud, speaking of his life before the war, of his studies at Harvard, of the young man who had once dreamed of teaching others about the wisdom contained in ancient texts. Ghost and spirit listened with what seemed like genuine interest, their eyes reflecting the firelight as he spoke. Sargent had settled nearby, the faithful gelding completing their unlikely family circle. Family. The word no longer felt foreign or painful to Jack. Instead, it filled him with a quiet joy, a sense of possibility he hadn't experienced in years. "We'll figure it out," he told the horses as his eyes grew heavy with approaching sleep. Day by day, season by season. Outside, winter still held the world in its grip, but inside the cabin, something new had taken root. An unexpected connection between species, a second chance for a man who had believed such things beyond his reach. As Jack drifted into sleep, Ghost maintained her watchful presence beside him, guardian and companion both, the mysterious white mare who had brought magic back into a life that had forgotten its existence.